Get out of the car. Now. The words cut through the quiet night like a blade, sharp and unquestioned, the kind of command that doesn't ask for understanding, only obedience. The fluorescent lights above the gas station flickered softly, casting a pale glow over the empty pumps and the long stretch of highway beyond, where the occasional semi-truck rumbled past like distant thunder. It was just after 10:30 p.m., the kind of hour when most people were already home, when the world slowed down and the roads felt lonelier than usual. Naomi Reed stood beside her car, the nozzle still in the tank, the faint smell of gasoline lingering in the cool air. She hadn't planned to stop here for long. Just a quick refill, maybe a bottle of water, then straight home. That was the plan. But plans had a way of changing when someone else decided you didn't belong. She turned her head slowly, her expression calm, her movements measured, as two officers approached with deliberate steps, their patrol car parked at an angle behind her vehicle, red and blue lights reflecting off the chrome surfaces around them. Officer Mark Dalton walked slightly ahead, his posture rigid, his eyes already locked onto her, as if he had made up his mind before saying a single word. Beside him, Officer Ethan Cruz scanned the scene with a quiet smirk, arms loose at his sides, the kind of presence that didn't need to speak to be understood. Naomi didn't move right away. Not because she didn't hear them, but because she understood something they didn't. The way this moment would unfold had already been decided in their minds. And no explanation, no calm reasoning, no quiet truth would change that. "Ma'am," I said, "step away from the vehicle," Dalton repeated, his voice firmer now, carrying the weight of authority that expected instant compliance. Naomi gently placed the nozzle back, the metallic click echoing louder than it should have in the stillness. Her hands were steady, her breathing even. She stepped back, just as instructed, her eyes meeting his for a brief second, not defiant, not afraid, just aware. Around them, a few people lingered near the convenience store entrance, their conversations fading as attention shifted. A man leaned against the ice machine, watching. Someone else pulled out a phone, subtle at first, then more obvious. The air changed. It always did. Dalton circled her car slowly, his gaze tracing every inch as if searching for something that hadn't yet been found. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" he asked, though the answer was already obvious. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, almost too calm for the tension building around them. "Getting gas." A simple answer. A truthful one. But truth, in moments like this, often felt irrelevant. Cruz let out a quiet chuckle under his breath, shaking his head as if amused by something only he could see. "Funny," he muttered. "Doesn't look that simple tonight." Naomi said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she let the silence stretch, heavy and uncomfortable, the kind of silence that forced people to sit with their own assumptions. The distant hum of highway traffic filled the gap, steady and indifferent. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. And then Dalton stepped closer. "We're going to need you to cooperate," he said, his tone now edged with something sharper, something less patient. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. If anything, it softened, just slightly, like someone watching a storm they already knew would pass. And then, almost quietly, she spoke. "You might want to remember tonight." The words weren't loud. They weren't threatening. But something about them lingered in the air longer than expected, like a note that didn't quite fade. Dalton frowned, just for a second, before brushing it off with a dismissive exhale. Because in his world, in that moment, there was no version of this story where he wasn't in control. No version where the woman standing in front of him was anything more than what he assumed she was. And that assumption, that quiet, unspoken certainty, was about to cost him everything. Dalton's hand hovered near his radio as he studied her face, searching for a crack that never came. The kind of hesitation or fear he was used to seeing. But Naomi Reed stood there unmoved, her posture straight, her expression composed in a way that felt almost out of place under the harsh glow of those overhead lights. And that calmness, that quiet refusal to react the way he expected, it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, even if only for a fraction of a second, because control relied on predictability, and she was giving him none of it, not a raised voice, not a rushed explanation, not even a defensive gesture, just stillness. And in that stillness there was something heavier than words, something he could not quite name, So instead he did what people like him always did when something did not make sense. He pushed harder. License and registration, he said, his tone clipped, already assuming resistance, already preparing for it. But Naomi did not argue. She reached slowly into her bag, every movement deliberate, careful, not out of fear, but out of understanding of how quickly a moment like this could be misread, and she handed over her identification without a word, her fingers steady, her eyes briefly glancing at the small crowd that had begun to form near the store entrance, the glow of phone screens reflecting in their faces, capturing something they did not fully understand, yet still felt compelled to watch, because scenes like this carried a strange gravity, one that pulled attention whether people wanted it or not. Cruz stepped closer now, peering over Dalton's shoulder, his voice low but audible enough to carry. "You ever notice how they always act calm like this?" he muttered, not really asking a question, more like confirming something he already believed. Dalton flipped through her license, his brow tightening slightly as he read her name. Naomi Reed. He repeated it quietly under his breath as if testing how it sounded, as if expecting it to mean something more than it did, but to him, in that moment, it did not. It was just another name, another stop, another routine interaction that would be forgotten by morning, or so he thought. "Step over here," he instructed, gesturing toward the front of the patrol car, and Naomi followed, her footsteps measured, the sound of her shoes against the pavement soft but steady, the night air cooler now, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic and the low murmur of onlookers who had begun whispering among themselves, some curious, some uncomfortable, but none stepping forward, because that line, the invisible one between observer and participant, was rarely crossed. Dalton spoke into his radio, requesting a check, his voice professional, controlled, the kind of tone that masked everything underneath. And as he waited for a response, seconds stretched longer than they should have, the silence filling with tension that no one acknowledged out loud. Naomi stood with her hands loosely at her sides, her gaze drifting briefly to the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of the convenience store, then back to Dalton, and for a moment, just a brief moment, their eyes met again, and this time there was something different, not confrontation, not submission, but recognition, as if she already knew how this would end, even if he did not. The radio crackled back, routine information, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that justified the weight of suspicion hanging in the air, but Dalton nodded anyway, as if confirmation had been given, because sometimes the decision was never about evidence. It was about instinct, or what people called instinct when they did not want to question it. Cruz shifted his weight, glancing at the small crowd, then back at Naomi. "You sure you want to keep this simple?" he said, a faint edge in his voice, like an invitation disguised as a warning. Naomi's lips parted slightly, not to argue, not to defend, but to speak with the same quiet certainty she had held since the beginning. "It is already simple," she said, her voice even, unwavering. And that was the moment something invisible settled into place, something neither officer recognized yet, something that would not reveal itself until it was far too late to change what had already been set in motion. The air seemed to tighten around them as the seconds stretched, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing had, and sometimes that silence, that refusal of the moment to resolve itself, was more unsettling than any sudden movement could ever be. Dalton shifted his stance slightly, glancing again at the license in his hand, as if expecting the name to change, as if staring at it long enough might reveal something hidden between the letters, but it remained the same. Naomi Reed, clean record, valid address. Nothing that justified the weight of suspicion that had already settled over the scene, and yet he did not step back. He did not nod and dismiss her, because by now this was no longer about a simple stop. It was about something deeper, something quieter, the need to be right, the need to maintain control in front of the watching eyes that had begun to multiply near the convenience store. Cruz noticed it too, the subtle shift in attention, the way people leaned just a little closer, the way phones were no longer hidden but openly recording. And that changed things, because when people watched, the performance had to continue. "We're going to run a few more checks," Dalton said, his voice steady, authoritative, the kind of tone that suggested procedure even when none was clearly required. Naomi gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, her hands still relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accepted whatever direction this night was going to take. And that calm, that quiet acceptance, it lingered in a way neither officer could fully process. Cruz stepped around her slowly, his eyes scanning not just her but the car, the pump, the ground beneath her feet, searching for something, anything, that could justify what had already begun. "You said you were just getting gas," he added, his voice carrying a faint edge. "That is all," Naomi replied, her tone even, her words simple. But simplicity had a way of frustrating those who were looking for complications. Dalton exhaled quietly, tapping the license against his palm as he made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a continuation of momentum, because once a moment like this started, it rarely stopped halfway. "Turn around for me," he said, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the kind of finality that left little room for interpretation. The murmurs from the small crowd softened into a tense quiet, like a room holding its breath without realizing it. Naomi paused, just for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. This was the point, the moment where assumption became action, where perception hardened into consequence. And then she turned, slowly, deliberately, her movements controlled, her gaze lifting briefly toward the dark sky above the gas station canopy, as if grounding herself in something beyond this moment, something larger than the narrow space they occupied. Dalton moved with practiced efficiency, guiding her hands gently but firmly, the click of metal echoing softly in the night air, not loud, not violent, just present, a sound that carried more weight than volume. Cruz stepped back, folding his arms as he watched, his earlier smirk fading into something more neutral, more observant, as if even he could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the kind that could not be explained but could not be ignored. Either, Naomi did not resist, she did not speak, she simply stood there, composed, her shoulders steady, her breathing unchanged, and for a moment, the entire scene felt suspended, like a photograph frozen in time. The flashing lights reflecting off the pavement, the quiet hum of the highway in the distance, the soft glow of phone screens capturing everything, and in the middle of it all, a woman who looked less like someone being controlled and more like someone waiting, patiently, knowingly, as if this was not the end of anything, but the beginning of something neither officer had yet imagined. Dalton cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You are being detained while we sort this out," he said, the words sounding official, procedural, almost routine, but even as he spoke them, there was a faint tension beneath the surface, something unspoken, something that lingered just beyond his awareness. Naomi's voice came then, soft but clear, cutting through the moment without force. "You already made your decision," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a truth that settled heavier than anything else that had been said that night. Dalton did not respond, not immediately, because there was nothing in his training that prepared him for that kind of calm, that kind of certainty, and so instead, he turned slightly, signaling toward the patrol car, continuing forward as if nothing had shifted, as if everything was still exactly as he believed it to be, but behind that belief, behind the steady rhythm of procedure and control, something had already begun to unravel, quietly, invisibly, like a thread pulled loose that no one noticed until the entire fabric started to come apart. The back door of the patrol car opened with a dull mechanical sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet of the night, and for a brief moment, everything slowed down again, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because the weight of what was happening had finally settled into the space around them. Naomi Reed stepped forward without being pushed, without hesitation, her movements steady and deliberate as she lowered herself into the back seat, the interior dimly lit, the faint smell of worn fabric and long hours lingering in the air. The door closed behind her with a firm click, sealing off the outside world, at least for now, and through the glass. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in soft pulses across her face, casting shifting shadows that moved but never changed her expression. Outside, Dalton adjusted his stance, glancing briefly toward the small crowd that had grown just enough to matter, their whispers low but persistent, their phones still raised, capturing a version of the moment that would never fully tell the story. Cruz leaned slightly against the side of the patrol car, arms crossed, his earlier confidence replaced, with a quieter watchfulness, not doubt, not regret, just a subtle awareness that something about this situation did not follow the usual pattern. "We should clear this up quick," he muttered, his voice low, almost casual, but there was a hint of something else beneath it, something unspoken. Dalton nodded once, as if agreeing, though his eyes lingered on the back seat for a second longer than necessary, as if trying to understand why the woman inside seemed so unaffected by everything that had just unfolded. He turned away, stepping toward the driver's side, opening the door and sliding into his seat with practiced familiarity. The radio crackled softly, dispatch voices overlapping in the background, routine calls, routine responses, the steady rhythm of a system that rarely paused long enough to question itself. Cruz followed, taking the passenger seat, the doors closing almost in unison, and for a moment, there was silence inside the vehicle, the kind that sits between people who are used to talking but have nothing immediate to say. Dalton placed the license on the center console, tapping it lightly as if grounding himself in something tangible, something official. "We will run her through again at the station," he said, more to fill the space than to inform. Cruz nodded, glancing back briefly through the metal divider, his eyes meeting Naomi's for a fraction of a second, and in that brief exchange, there was no fear, no anger, just a calm presence that felt out of place in the back of a police car. He looked away quickly, clearing his throat as if dismissing the thought before it could settle. The engine started, the low hum filling the cabin, and as the patrol car pulled away from the gas station, the scene behind them faded into distance, the lights shrinking, the figures dispersing, the moment dissolving for everyone except the three people inside that vehicle. Naomi leaned her head back slightly against the seat, her gaze fixed forward, not on the officers, not on the road, but somewhere beyond both, her hands resting calmly, her posture unchanged, as if this was not a disruption but a continuation, as if the path she was on had always been leading here. Dalton focused on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, the familiarity of the drive grounding him in routine, in procedure, in the certainty that everything would unfold the way it always did, because it always had. The station lights appeared ahead after a few minutes, bright against the dark sky, a place of order, of process, of decisions made and recorded, a place where control was reinforced, not questioned. The car slowed as it approached, turning into the lot with a smooth, practiced motion, and as they came to a stop, the engine idling softly, there was that pause again, that brief moment where everything seemed to hold still before the next step. Dalton exhaled, reaching for the door handle. But before he stepped out, Naomi's voice came from the back, calm, steady, unchanged. "This part matters more than you think," she said, not loudly, not urgently, just a simple statement that hung in the air longer than expected. Dalton did not respond right away, his hand resting on the handle, his eyes fixed forward, and for a split second, something flickered across his expression, not fear, not realization, just the faintest hint of hesitation, and then it was gone, replaced by the same certainty he had carried from the beginning. Because in his world, moments like this were never turning points, they were just steps in a process, and he had no reason to believe that this time would be any different, none at all. The fluorescent lights inside the station hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over everything they touched, the kind of light that erased warmth and replaced it with something colder, something procedural, the kind of place where moments were reduced to reports, where people became entries in a system that rarely paused to ask deeper questions. Dalton stepped out of the patrol car first, the night air briefly returning before the station doors closed behind them. Cruz followed, opening the rear door and gesturing for Naomi to step out. She did so without resistance, her posture unchanged, her movements calm and measured. As her shoes touched the pavement once more, and for a brief second, as she looked up at the building in front of her, there was something almost familiar in her gaze, not recognition of the place itself, but of what it represented. Inside, the front desk officer glanced up as they entered, his eyes moving quickly from Dalton to Cruz, and then to Naomi, taking in the scene in a way that suggested he had seen versions of it countless times before. Dalton spoke first, his voice steady. "We need to process her," he said, placing the identification on the counter with a soft tap. The officer nodded, already reaching for paperwork, the routine unfolding without hesitation, without question, because routine did not require explanation. Naomi stood quietly beside the counter, her eyes moving slowly across the room, observing, taking in details others overlooked, the layout, the movement, the subtle exchanges between officers who thought no one was paying attention. Cruz leaned slightly against the counter, watching her again, that same quiet curiosity lingering just beneath his surface confidence. "You could have made this easier," he said, not harshly, not aggressively, just as a statement that reflected his perspective. Naomi turned her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "It was always going to be this way," she replied, her voice calm, almost reflective, and for a moment, Cruz frowned. Not because he disagreed, but because he did not fully understand what she meant. The front desk officer cleared his throat, breaking the brief silence as he handed Dalton a clipboard. "Fill this out," he said, his tone neutral. Dalton took it without comment, beginning to write, the scratch of pen against paper filling the space between them. Naomi remained still, her hands relaxed, her gaze steady, as if time itself moved differently for her in that moment, as if she was not caught in the process but observing it from a distance. Minutes passed, small ones, insignificant, on their own, but heavy in accumulation, the kind that stretched when no one was speaking, when the air carried more tension than sound. Finally, the officer behind the desk nodded. "She will need to wait in holding until we clear everything," he said. Dalton signed the last line and handed back the clipboard. "Understood," he replied, his voice returning to that familiar tone of authority, of control, as if nothing about this situation had challenged that. Cruz straightened slightly, gesturing toward the hallway. "This way," he said. Naomi followed, her steps quiet against the polished floor, the corridor ahead narrow, lined with closed doors and the faint echo of distant voices. The deeper they moved into the station, the quieter it became, until even the outside world felt distant, almost irrelevant. They reached the holding area, the space simple, functional, devoid of anything unnecessary. Cruz opened the door and stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. Naomi paused at the threshold, just briefly, her eyes lifting to meet his, and in that moment, something shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible, but present. "You still have time to think about what you are doing," she said softly, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as something closer to advice. Cruz hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the words catching somewhere between dismissal and consideration, but habit won, as it usually did. He gave a small shake of his head, stepping back into his role, into the rhythm he knew. Naomi stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality, and as the lock clicked into place, the sound echoed just enough to linger. Cruz stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the door, as if expecting something to change, but nothing did. Everything remained exactly as it appeared, controlled, contained, routine, and yet beneath that surface, beneath the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet shuffle of paperwork, something else had already begun to move, something neither he nor Dalton could see yet, something that would not stay contained for long. Time moved differently inside the holding room, not slower, not faster, but heavier, each second settling into the air like it carried weight. Naomi Reed sat on the narrow bench, her posture straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze steady and unfocused, as if she was not looking at the walls around her, but through them, beyond them, to something that had already been set in motion long before tonight began. Outside the room, the station continued in its usual rhythm, phones ringing, officers moving from one desk to another, paperwork being signed and filed, the quiet machinery of process working exactly as it always did. Dalton stood near the front desk again, reviewing the report he had started, his pen tapping lightly against the paper as he filled in the final details, location, time, reason for detainment, each word written with the confidence of routine, the kind that did not question itself. Cruz leaned against a nearby desk, scrolling briefly through his phone before locking the screen, his attention drifting back toward the hallway that led to the holding area. Something about the situation lingering in his mind in a way he could not easily dismiss. "You ever get that feeling?" he said quietly, not looking directly at Dalton. Like something is off. Even when everything checks out, Dalton did not look up immediately, his focus still on the report. No, he replied after a moment, his tone firm, almost dismissive. Everything does check out. He underlined the last line and set the pen down, as if that settled it. As if putting it on paper made it final. Cruz nodded slowly, though the expression on his face suggested he was not entirely convinced, just accustomed to. Moving forward anyway. Minutes passed, then more, the clock on the wall ticking forward with steady indifference, until the front desk officer called out. "We got something," his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the station. Dalton turned, stepping closer. "What is it?" he asked. The officer glanced at the screen, then back at the identification, then back at the screen again, his brow tightening slightly. "Her name," he said slowly. "It is flagged, but not the way you would expect." Dalton frowned, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the monitor. "What do you mean?" The officer hesitated, just briefly, as if choosing his words carefully. "It is connected to the court system, higher-level access," he said, scrolling through the information. "Judicial clearance." The word hung there for a moment. Unfamiliar in this context, Dalton leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the screen more carefully now, the confidence that had carried him through the night beginning to shift, not collapsing, not yet, but bending, just enough to create space for doubt. "That does not make sense," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Cruz stepped closer as well, his earlier curiosity sharpening into something more focused. "Are you sure it is the same person?" he asked. The officer nodded, pointing at the details. "Name, date of birth, everything matches." The room seemed to quiet around them, not because the sound stopped, but because their attention narrowed, pulling inward toward this single point of information that did not fit the pattern they had been following. Dalton straightened slightly, exhaling through his nose as if steadying himself. "Run it again," he said. The officer complied, typing quickly, the keys clicking softly, the screen refreshing, the same result appearing again, unchanged, undeniable. Cruz glanced toward the hallway leading to the holding area, then back at Dalton. "So what are you saying?" he asked, his voice lower now, more cautious. The officer hesitated again, then spoke plainly. "I am saying she is not just anyone," he said. "She is part of the system." And that word, system, landed differently now. Heavier, more complex than it had felt before. Dalton's jaw tightened slightly, his mind moving quickly, retracing the steps of the night, the stop, the questions, the decision, each moment now viewed through a lens that had shifted. "Without his permission, that does not change anything," he said, though the certainty in his voice was no longer as solid as it had been. Cruz did not respond right away, his gaze still fixed on the hallway, on the closed door behind which Naomi sat, calm, composed, waiting. "It might," he said finally, quietly, and for the first time since the night began, the balance between them, between assumption and reality, began to tilt, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that the next step would not feel the same as the last, enough that something irreversible had already begun. The word lingered longer than it should have. System, not just as a label, but as a realization, something that quietly reshaped the room, without moving a single object. Dalton stepped back from the desk, his eyes no longer fixed on the screen, but somewhere slightly beyond it, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same reality, the one he believed he was in and the one that had just been revealed. "Judicial clearance does not mean she is a judge," he said, his voice measured, controlled. But there was a subtle strain beneath it now, the kind that appeared when certainty started to fracture. The front desk officer nodded cautiously. "No, but it means she is connected at a level that requires verification before any further processing," he replied, choosing his words carefully. Cruz exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of his neck as his gaze drifted once again toward the hallway, the closed door at the end of it now carrying a different weight, no longer just a holding room, but something closer to a question waiting to be answered. "We should talk to her," he said quietly. Dalton did not respond immediately, his jaw tightening slightly as he considered the suggestion, because talking now meant acknowledging that something might have been missed, and acknowledgement was not something that came easily, especially not in a room built on routine and authority, but but silence stretched just long enough that even he could feel the shift. "Fine," he said finally, his tone firm but less absolute than before. They moved down the hallway together, their footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor, each step carrying a subtle hesitation that had not been there earlier, as if the ground beneath them had changed in a way they could not fully see. When they reached the holding room door, Cruz paused for a fraction of a second before unlocking it, the small metallic sound breaking the quiet. He opened the door slowly, stepping aside as Dalton entered first. Naomi Reed remained seated exactly as they had left her, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her gaze lifting to meet theirs without surprise, without urgency, as if she had been expecting this moment not as a possibility, but as an inevitability. Dalton cleared his throat, standing just inside the doorway, the authority in his stance still present, but no longer unshaken. "We ran your information again," he began, his voice steady. Though the edge of certainty had softened, Naomi said nothing, her eyes steady on him, waiting, allowing the silence to settle before he continued. "There seems to be a discrepancy," he added, choosing a word that felt safer than the truth. Naomi's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in her gaze, something almost like recognition, not of the situation, but of his attempt to control it. "There is no discrepancy," she said calmly, her voice even, grounded. "There is only information you did not look for the first time." The words landed without force, but with precision. Cruz shifted slightly behind Dalton, his attention fully fixed on her now, the earlier doubt in his mind sharpening into something clearer, something harder to ignore. Dalton straightened, his instinct pushing back against the implication. "If there is something relevant, you should have stated it," he replied, his tone firm, defensive. Naomi held his gaze, unblinking. "That is not how this works," she said, not dismissively, but with quiet certainty. "You made a decision based on what you assumed, not what you verified." The room fell silent again, heavier this time, because the words did not just describe the situation, they defined it, and definitions, once spoken clearly, were difficult to undo. Cruz glanced between them, the tension now fully visible, no longer hidden beneath routine or procedure. "What exactly are we missing?" he asked, his voice lower, more direct. Naomi's gaze shifted briefly to him, then back to Dalton, as if acknowledging the question but choosing her response carefully. "You are not missing it," she said softly. "You are standing inside it." The statement lingered, not as a riddle, but as a truth that had not yet been fully understood. Dalton's expression tightened, the need to regain control pressing against the edges of his composure. "Then explain it," he said, his voice sharper now, not loud, but edged with urgency. Naomi paused, just briefly, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and in that pause, something shifted again, something subtle but irreversible. "Tomorrow," she said simply. "You will see it clearly." The word hung in the air, tomorrow, not distant, not vague, but close enough to feel immediate, close enough to carry weight. Dalton stared at her for a moment longer, searching for something, anything that would restore the balance he had lost. But there was nothing to find, only that same calm, that same unshaken certainty. And for the first time since the night began, the outcome was no longer something he could define. Cruz stepped back slightly, exhaling under his breath, the realization settling deeper now, not fully formed, but undeniable. Dalton turned without another word, stepping out of the room, the need to move, to act, to regain structure overriding everything else. Cruz followed, the door closing behind them once more, but this time, the sound did not feel final. It felt temporary, like a pause before something much larger, something that would not stay contained, something that was already on its way. The night eventually gave way to morning, not with any dramatic shift, but with the quiet inevitability of time moving forward, the station returning to its usual rhythm as if nothing significant had happened. Reports filed, conversations resumed, the weight of the previous night settling into routine documentation. Dalton sat at his desk reviewing the finalized report once more, the words now feeling less solid than they had when he first wrote them, each line carrying a subtle uncertainty that had not been there before. Cruz stood nearby, coffee in hand, his gaze drifting occasionally toward the front doors. As officers came and went, the conversation from the night before still lingering between them even in silence. "You still think this is nothing?" Cruz asked finally, his voice low, not confrontational, but searching. Dalton did not look up immediately, his pen tapping lightly against the desk. "We followed procedure," he replied, though the statement sounded more like justification than certainty now. Cruz nodded slowly, but his expression suggested that procedure alone no longer felt like enough. Before either of them could continue, a voice called out from across the room. "Dalton, Cruz, you are needed downtown." The tone formal, direct, leaving little room for delay. Dalton looked up, his brow tightening slightly. "For what?" he asked. The officer approaching held out a document. "Hearing scheduled this morning, related to last night's detainment." Dalton took the paper, scanning it quickly, his eyes moving across the lines until they stopped, not because he reached the end, but because something in the middle caught his attention, something that made the rest of the words fade into the background. Cruz stepped closer, reading over his shoulder, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the information did not just confirm what they had begun to suspect, it clarified it in a way that left no room for interpretation. "That does not make sense," Dalton said quietly, though this time there was no resistance in his voice, only disbelief. The name printed clearly. At the top of the document, Naomi Reed, presiding judge, courtroom assignment already set, time listed in precise detail, less than an hour from now. Cruz exhaled slowly, setting his coffee down on the nearest desk, the reality of the situation settling in with a weight that was impossible to ignore. "She told us," he said, almost to himself. Dalton remained still for a moment longer. The paper held firmly in his hand, the edges slightly creased where his grip had tightened without him realizing it. The room around them continued as usual, officers moving, phones ringing, conversations overlapping, but for Dalton, the noise felt distant now, as if he had stepped into a different space entirely, one where the assumptions of the night before no longer applied. "We need to go," Cruz said, his voice steady, grounded in the urgency of what this meant. Dalton nodded once, standing abruptly, the chair behind him sliding back with a soft scrape against the floor. They moved quickly now, not rushed, but purposeful, the kind of movement that came when time suddenly mattered in a way it had not before. Outside, the morning air was crisp, the city already awake, traffic building, people moving through their routines unaware of the shift that had taken place for two men walking toward their patrol car. The drive downtown felt shorter than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because their focus had narrowed, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with realization. Cruz glanced out the window as buildings passed by, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. "What do you think happens now?" he asked. Dalton kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind was no longer anchored in the same certainty it had held the night before. "Now," he said after a moment, his voice quieter, more measured, "we find out." The courthouse came into view ahead, its structure imposing, familiar yet different under the weight of what they now knew. The car slowed as they approached, turning into the lot, the building standing there not just as a place of law, but as something far more personal now, something that had already begun to reshape everything they thought they understood. And as they stepped out of the car, the final piece of the night's unfinished story stood waiting just beyond those doors, no longer hidden, no longer distant, but ready to be seen clearly, exactly as she had said it would be. The courthouse doors opened with a quiet heaviness, the kind that did not come from the weight of the wood or the metal hinges, but from what waited on the other side. Dalton stepped in first, his posture still upright, still controlled, but no longer carrying the same certainty that had followed him the night before. Cruz walked beside him, his gaze scanning the room with a different awareness now, not just observing, but searching. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with polished floors and muted voices, people moving with purpose, attorneys carrying files, clerks speaking in low tones, the quiet order of a system that functioned on structure and hierarchy. They followed the signs toward the assigned courtroom, each step bringing them closer to something neither of them could fully prepare for. The door was already open, a few people seated inside, the low murmur of conversation filling the space. Dalton paused just outside for a brief moment, his hand hovering near the frame, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that once he stepped inside, whatever uncertainty remained would be replaced by something far more defined. Cruz glanced at him, then forward, and without a word, they entered. The room was simple, structured. The judge's bench elevated at the front, empty for now, the seal of justice mounted above it, silent, unmoving, yet somehow more present than anything else in the room. They took their place to the side, standing where they had been instructed. The air felt different here, not tense in the same way as the night before, but heavier, more deliberate, the kind of weight that came from rules that could not be ignored. A clerk moved near the bench, organizing documents, glancing occasionally toward the door behind it, as if waiting for a signal. The murmurs in the room softened, then faded, until a quiet settled in, not forced, but natural, like everyone understood something important was about to happen. And then, the door behind the bench opened, slow, steady, and every eye in the room shifted in that direction. The sound of footsteps followed, measured, confident, echoing softly across the floor. Dalton felt it before he fully saw it. That shift, that moment where everything aligned into clarity. Naomi Reed stepped forward, no longer in the same presence they had encountered the night before, but not different either, not truly, because the calm had always been there, the certainty had always been there. It was only the position that had changed, or perhaps it had not changed at all, only revealed. She moved toward the bench with quiet authority, her expression composed, her gaze steady as she took her seat. The room remained silent, not out of shock, but out of recognition. The kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. Dalton stood still, his mind replaying every moment from the night before, the questions, the assumptions, the decisions made without pause, each one now returning with a clarity that had not existed before. Cruz lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, unable to look away, because now there was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to question, only the reality in front of them. Naomi adjusted the papers in front of her, her movements precise, unhurried, and then she looked up, her eyes meeting theirs for just a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far more controlled, something that carried weight without force. Court is now in session, she said, her voice clear, steady, filling the room without effort. And in that moment, everything shifted completely, not because she had changed, but because they finally understood where they had been standing all along. Dalton's shoulders tightened slightly, the realization settling deeper than any consequence ever could. Cruz remained still, his earlier doubts now replaced by a quiet understanding that could not be undone. The roles had not reversed by chance. They had been revealed by truth, and the truth did not need to raise its voice to be heard. It only needed time. Naomi's gaze moved forward, addressing the room, continuing with the process as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, as if this was simply another day, another case, another moment in a system built on decisions and consequences. But for Dalton and Cruz, nothing about this was routine anymore, because the line they thought they controlled had shifted beneath them, and now they stood on the other side of it, not as the ones making assumptions, but as the ones facing them. And in the quiet that followed, in the steady rhythm of the courtroom proceeding, one thought remained, clear and unshakable. He thought he was the law, but the law had been standing right in front of him all along.